These two sessions will explain two color management concepts: TrueLight color spaces developed by FilmLight and the Academy color encoding specification called ACES developed by the Academy. We will also learn the common concepts and underlying motivations. The first session concentrates on color management in a more general fashion. We will go through traditional grading and color management workflows, and then we will point out challenges we are facing today and formulate requirements for digital image reproduction. Before we start with new technology, it is handy to keep in mind how we did color grading the last decades. These techniques were used to color correct feature films, commercials, and TV content shot on traditional film and early video cameras. We at Filmlight saw three different major grading techniques in the industry: the film style grading technique, the telecine style grading technique, and the video grading technique. The film style digital grading technique is a pretty new and modern grading style developed in the early days of digital intermediate workflows. Also, it is a quite young grading technique. Its concepts are derived from the classical film color timing process. Typically, the scene was shot on 35mm film, which had, apart from the toe and shoulder, a pretty linear response to light. The negative film was scanned on a film scanner, like FilmLight's Northlight. The negative film could hold a gray dynamic range of more than 10 stops, much more than a traditional display or projector could represent. In order to store the linear data efficiently, a logarithmic encoding scheme was used for storing the data. We will come to that point later in greater detail. The logarithmic stored data was loaded into a color correction system like FilmLight's Spacelight. But the grading system was not the only color changing process in the chain. The graded data was recorded back to intermediate negatives film and then printed to a positive film, which then was projected using a film projector. There was a very color changing process in the print process, which was implicitly brought into the film labs by Kodak, Fuji, and Technicolor. They used this process to introduce a dynamic range reduction and color altering in order to achieve a pleasing lookage image on a low dynamic range medium, which was at the time the film print. It could not show more than 9 stops in the final projection. This process was carefully developed by the color scientists of Kodak, Fuji, and Technicolor over the last several decades. We will explain some of their concepts later. So in order to have a meaningful digital color grading session, the color engineer at the film lab needed to simulate that process which happened in the film lab. They use color management tools like FilmLight's TrueLight to generate a color transformation which mimics or previews the behavior of the print process. It was the so-called film lookup table or preview lookup table. The colorist accessed and graded the high dynamic range data, but viewed the result during his grading with the film simulation applied at the output of the system. So he graded in a high dynamic range domain. While exporting the graded material, the preview LUT was not applied. The result was a high dynamic range data which was sent to the film recorder. If the calibration was accurate, the print film matched that what the colorist saw while grading. The film grade operator in Baselight was specifically designed for that way of working. As the material was almost scene referred, people referred to this as a scene referred grading. Now we have a brief look how the color grading system reacts in this color grading workflow. We have a log scan here, and on the output or the cursor we apply a print film simulation transform. This transform simulates the process which happens in the film lab. Notice how the transform produces a pleasing looking image. As we grade before the print film simulation, we can take advantage of various aspects in that transformation, like the gentle highlight and shadow compression. The film grade operator was designed for this workflow. The exposure reacts like the printer lights. With the contrast operator, we can match the scene contrast to the dynamic range of the display. To fine adjust the areas in the highlight and shadows, we have highlight and shadow controls on a second tab. Notice in the vector scope how the saturation is handled. There is also a concept of gamut compression. Then, after the rise of digital film cameras, there was a mix of input source, both digital and analog. The digital film sensor have also linear response to light, but all different digital cameras had their own capture color space and high dynamic range. Film labs needed to transfer the color spaces of each camera into the Cineon printing density space in order to match them to the film scans and to be compatible with the output to film. Later, film nearly disappeared as acquisition medium, but there was still a need for the Cineon-centric workflow because film print was still the master distribution medium. With digital rollout in cinemas, film lost its importance as delivery medium and the DCP package gained popularity. Nowadays there is no film-based delivery in many film productions. So the question arose if these Cineon-driven workflows are still needed or valid. Why should we simulate something which does not exist anymore? In the same time and even earlier, there was a very different color grading technique in TV-centric productions. The telecine grading technique is older than the DI style grading technique. Before digital and file-based grading was the norm, this major grading technique was heavily used in the tape-to-tape color grading process. There was no need to simulate a film lab and their processes because a delivery on film was not needed in the most cases. The captured medium was the same film, 35 and 60mm. In contrast to the digital intermediate workflows, the film negative was not scanned but was digitized using a telecine. The output of the telecine was designed to produce a low dynamic range Rec. 709 compliant signal. However, the colorist tried to keep all of the high dynamic range information in this digitization process so that they have maximum quality at the grading stage. You could say that the output of the telecine was a soft or loggish Rec. 709, containing all the information the film negative captured. This loggish or washed out material was the starting point for grading, but it was hardly seen linear anymore. The final delivery was for television, which they could hook directly to the grading system, so there was no color management or color transformation involved at the output. The colorist started grading until it looked pleasing to him and the client, judging the result directly on a reference monitor. Again, we have a brief look at how a telecine setup would react. We take the same image but don't apply a print film simulation on output. Typically, a colorist would choose the video grading operator as his main grading tool. He adds contrast until it looks pleasing to him and the client. Notice that there is no concept of soft clip in the highlights or shadow. Also, saturation reacts linearly. Then there was the same impact of high dynamic range digital film cameras. All of them had their own capture color space. As there was no color management in place, the colorist was in charge to match the digital cameras to the film material. Also in TV workflows, film mostly disappeared as acquisition medium, and the variety of digital film cameras increased. The colorist alone was in charge to match a certain camera to another. The video grading technique was the dominant workflow for faster production turnarounds, like daily drama, news, or image movies. The majority of broadcast facilities worked with this grading technique. The cameras in use were analog or digital video camcorders, which produced already a low dynamic range signal ready to view on a broadcast monitor. All the color signs happened in the camera internally. Each camera manufacturer had its own way how to produce the monitor signal coming from the, again, linear sensor. The images were loaded into the grading system without color management, and also the output was hooked to the monitor without any color management. Due to the low dynamic range input, the colorist was more limited in his work. For example, clipped highlights could not be recovered. Let's examine the same scene in video grading. Here I already produced a Rec. 709 image from the scan. and started to grade basically after the print film process. Especially in the highlights, we noticed that there is less dynamic range accessible for grading, as the dynamic range we have at our disposal is limited. Now that we have seen the three major grading techniques from the past, we could raise the question which one is the most future-proof, or which one meets the modern demand the best, or maybe is there a new or better grading technique? First we ask us, what are the demands or requirements nowadays? Nowadays all major digital cameras capture high dynamic range representation of the scene with more than 10 stops. In some research projects people produced moving images with a dynamic range up to 17 stops. So a future-proof grading technique should account for that and should allow creative people to access all the captured information. It is getting more and more common to mix different digital film cameras in one production, so a grading workflow should handle or assist with different technical color spaces. The variety of delivery media will grow in the near future. Different deliveries for cinema, wide gamut TV, standard TV, and different web versions will be a common demand. A grading workflow should account for that. A lot of shots in a production nowadays and in the future are not only shown as they were shot. Visual effects has a great impact today and will grow in the future. As the input source is high dynamic range material, we want to make sure that the interchange between departments and facilities stay in a high dynamic range domain. A unique look to each production is a creative desire nowadays. A special look on a given device should be communicated as soon as possible. This demands may conflict with the demand for high dynamic range interchange workflows. A grading workflow should allow for the best known and most pleasing color reproduction. Some could claim that the solution would be to not use color management at all, and just let the colorist be responsible for every color aspect and demands of a production. However, this solution might raise some challenges at different stages of the workflow, just to name a few. Leaving the colorist alone with mixed material without any assistance may not be practical because there are technical differences between different camera color spaces. Nowadays, we are confronted with different camera transfer function and color gamuts. We will dig into that in greater detail on the next slides. Tone and color mapping. Also, lack of color rendition or color rendering adds additional work to the colorist's job. Work which was already solved by several color scientists at Kodak, Fuji, Technicolor, the Academy or ARRI the last decades. We will see some aspects of color rendering on the next slides. If there is no color management framework in place which introduced the concept of scene-referred and display-referred color spaces, it is hardly possible to implement a high dynamic range interchange workflow between visual effects and post-production. Also, visual effects work and CG integration. It's much easier if we have the concept of scene linearity. If we look at those four images, it is the same scene, same lighting condition, shot with different cameras. If I would ask you a catchy question, which image reflects the tone scale of the scene faithfully? Of course the answer would be no one, because each of the images are viewed on a sRGB monitor unprocessed in its own camera color space. On the right we see some different transfer functions, log-C, red log, S-log and so on. We see they are all slightly different. You could ask the question, why are they all different? First we examine how a sensor sees the world. Each sensor, no matter if it is from an ARRI Alexa, Red Dragon, Sony f65 or your handy camera. A digital sensor has an almost linear response to light, often referred as linear light. What does it mean? Let's see this simple unscientific graph. The x-axis has the units candles, and the y-axis is the unitless output of the sensor, no matter if it's volt or code values. If I put 0 candles in a room, the sensor captures 0. We do not consider noise or flare models for these simple examples. If I put 1 candle in a room, the sensor outputs 1. If I put 2 candles in a room, the sensor outputs 2. If I put 1000 candles in a room, the sensor outputs 1000. And if I put 1001 candles in a room, the sensor outputs 1001. It is linear to the light energy on the set. Pretty simple. We humans see quite different. Again, we examine a really non-scientific graph here. We have candles on the x-axis and a unitless y-axis describing the perceived brightness. Please note that this is more than a very simplified look at our human perception. In reality, our perceived brightness is affected by many other variables, like absolute brightness, spectral composition of the scene, and many more. Anyway, if I put one candle in a room, the brain sees one. If I put two candles in a room, the brain perceives two. But to get to a perceived brightness of 3, I need to add 4 candles. To rise the perceived brightness to 4, I need to add 8 candles, and so on. 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, etc. If a human sees a room with 1000 candles and someone adds one more candle, the observer would hardly see any difference. We would need to add another 1000 candles to perceive a change like we did with 1 candle to 2 candles. You could think of the y-axis as stops or f-stops. Rising one stop means doubling the amount of light. Reducing one stop means halving the amount of light. By knowing that, we could argue that linear light stored in integer code values is pretty inefficient in terms of human perception. This image shows how a digital sensor sees the world. I think it makes things clear that the lower parts are not so good captured as the bright areas. Another example. Imagine we would have a camera sensor with a bit depth of 10 bits having 1024 steps. If we start at the maximum a camera can see before it clips, which would be 1024. If we go down one stop, we end up on code value 512. Half the light or half the linear light code values means one stop. This means the first stop below the clipping is quantized or represented with 512 steps. If we go again one stop down, we end up on 256. Again, half of 512. So the second stop above the clipping is quantized with 256 steps. We need to keep in mind that the first 2 stops of a camera consume 75% of all code values we have. We see that the lower we get, the worse our stops are captured. So people started to come up with a better scaling. They converted the scale into a much better balanced tone scale according to our human vision. They use gamma and log functions for that. The goal is to quantize each stop with the same amount of code values. So far so good. But each camera manufacturer makes it a bit different. That's why we end up having different log and gamma flavors for all the different camera models. Here you can see the same image as before, converted with different log and gamma functions. But again, all the sensors were linear in the first place. The log encoding happened afterwards in the camera processing or in the debuyer process. So if we know the functions the camera manufacturer used, we can then undo the camera conversion and go back to linear light, where all cameras are around about the same. It is a simple mathematical function for each camera. If you would choose a naive color grading workflow, a colorist would try to do this by eye, with tools like Lift Gamma Gain, which were never designed for this kind of operations. The next problem is the color gamut. Again, I ask you a tricky question. Same scene, same lighting condition, 4 different cameras. Which one produced the right skin tones? Again, the answer would be none of them, because we view them wrong. Cameras have different color gamuts due to the different spectral properties of the optical and electronic elements. So we will not get the same color gamut for all of the sensors, but we can help bring them all close together. Let's explain what a color gamut is first. For this, we take the analogy of a map. You can think of a color gamut as a map. Of course, this is a very simple analogy, but to get an understanding, it might help. This map is a pretty small map of central London. You can think of this as a small color gamut like sRGB. Each location on the map corresponds to a single color value. For this example, we pick the Filmlight headquarters, which is in the middle of the map. The location is described as a tuple of x and y coordinates. For this color or location, it is 0.5, 0.5. But this description is only true for this map. If we go to a greater map, 0.5, 0.5 does not stand for the same location or color. 0.5, 0.5 is now the Heathrow Airport. The FilmLight headquarter in this map has a different coordinate, 0.9, 0.65. Again, a third example of an even bigger map or color gamut. In this map, the location of FilmLight headquarter is 0.35, 0.85. So the same spot or the same color has different coordinates depending on the map they are encoded in. But color management can help there. If we know the different corners of the maps, we can scale, translate and rotate them into an even bigger map so that all colors they include are aligned to the same spot. Of course, it is all an approximation, but the heavy lifting can be done by color management. A naive solution would not account for that problem. A colorist would try to match different color spaces, basically doing color space transformations, with tools which were again not designed for this kind of operations. Let's have a brief look at some concepts of color rendering. Color rendering or display color rendering can be seen as a transformation that transforms scene-referred high dynamic range data into display-referred low dynamic range data in a pleasing looking fashion. This is achieved by a lot of human perception-based concepts and models. In the past, this so-called pleasing color reproduction was baked into the printing process developed by Kodak, Fuji and Technicolor over the last decades. The first thing we look at is the tone scale. In a pleasing display color rendering transform, there is a S-shaped curve that maps and compresses all the high dynamic range values pleasingly into the low dynamic range image. This is important to allow for additional specular highlights above the diffuse white. Also, if grading before the color rendering, a colorist can take advantage of the soft tone compression on both sides of the tone scale. This shape is not a simple highlight roll-off you would find in a grading tool, but a complex and carefully designed function based on endless tests with lots of test persons. In terms of color, there are many human perception concepts which are addressed in the several display rendering transforms. Just to get a small insight, we have a qualitative look at some concepts. The Hunt effect. Imagine you stand in front of a flower in a park at bright daylight. The flower looks great, colorful and crisp. If you go to the same flower at a clear moonlight lit night, you see a less colorful and dull flower. But the spectral properties of that flower has not changed. The main issue for this effect happens in our eyes and brain. We humans perceive less colorfulness when the absolute light levels are lowered. If you look at nowadays light levels in an average cinema for diffuse white, the light levels in the cinema are typically much lower as the light levels of the shot scene. So if we would correctly reproduce the relative colors, which is referred as equivalent color reproduction, the image would appear less colorful and less contrasty as we have it in our memory from the scene we shot. Color management can compensate for that in a complex and general way. Just for you to know, the reduction of colorfulness is not only an equal loss of saturation, but it is different for all of the spectral bands. Another effect which is considered in display rendering transforms is the so-called Poynter gamut. There was a professor called Dr. Michael Poynter who tried to measure all reflected colors in the world. So he took a lot of samples of natural objects. After he was finished, he came up with the Poynter gamut, which is the gamut of all natural or surface colors in the world. Let's refer to a good analogy of treating color spaces as maps. We could claim that the Poynter gamut is the whole Earth globe. If we compare the color gamut of a print film, we see that it has quite the same shape and size. If we look at Rec. 709, we see that it fills quite a big part of the pointer gamut, but there are still parts missing. We also see that some corners of the Rec 709 space are outside of the pointer gamut. Saying that, it means that you can produce colors on a Rec 709 monitor which you cannot find in real-world surface colors, but only on that specific display device. As a 3 primary device only can have a triangle shape, we need to further enlarge the color space to get all of the pointer gamut. P3 is a good example for that. P3 includes more pointer colors than Rec 709, but at the same time it has more colors outside the pointer gamut. So practically speaking, if you would increase saturation in P3, you would easily create colors outside the pointer gamut, making your image look unnatural. A display rendering transform tries to assist you with a gentle gamut compression, so your images will have a natural look also if you go for a saturated look. These are just a few concepts which are built into display rendering transform, making it a complex but helpful tool. Here we see the code of the ASYS RRT, which is the ASYS display rendering transform. This slide is not there to explain the display rendering itself, but to show that there is a great effort and complexity in there that tries to help you making better images. High dynamic range images store all the information which were captured on set. We want to stay in the high dynamic range domain when we exchange assets between visual effects and post-production. Unfortunately, high dynamic range images look unpleasant when we view them on a low dynamic range display. When the director or DOP runs into the room, he wants to see the intended look and not the high dynamic range data. You can think of sunglasses you put on to view the HDR data so that it looks pleasant. In the past, there was no single display rendering transform or sunglasses which transformed the HDR image into a pleasing looking image, because each film lab had a slightly different chemical process, and some film labs tended to not publish their display rendering transform. So there is an industry-wide need to have a common way of going from HDR color spaces to low dynamic range color spaces. So now we have an understanding of the input challenges, the intermediate challenges, and the output challenges we are facing nowadays. TrueLight color spaces and ASYS will be converted in a second session. I hope you enjoyed this one. See you soon.